Hey guys, it's Kevin from Mix Coach again, and in this series we're talking about the basics of mixing. Last week we talked about filters and how important filters are, and this week is going to be a little bit of an extension of that, but different in the same way. We're talking about EQ today. EQ. Now, what is EQ? Let's pretend that you could take a sound and you could divide it up into, let's just say, 31 different slices, and each slice had a different tone to it, right? As the lower slices would have more of a woofy sound, of a low frequency sound. As you came on up, you would get more of a boxy sound. In the middle, you'd get more of a honk sound. And as you get up, you get more of a sibilant sound. And at the top, you get more of an air sound where you barely noticed anything except for just the way it felt, right? So you have a sound divided into 31 different sections, all right? Now, let's pretend that you can put a volume knob on each one of those. And let's just say that if you wanted it to sound more boxy, you just go to the boxy section and you turn it up, right? Or if you wanted it to sound more airy, you'd go to the very top and you'd push that up until it sounded more airy. Or let's just say in the other way, that you didn't want it to sound as boxy. So you found that boxy fader and you pulled down the boxy, right? Or if it had too much sibilance in it, you went to the sibilance part and you pulled down the sibilance part. The sibilance is the S's and the T's and the things that really define conversation and lyrics and things like that. Well, that is exactly the case with EQ. What I just described to you was a 31 band graphic EQ. Now, graphic EQ, you would think that graphic, in our modern age, graphic EQ seems like it would be something more graphic than it is. But basically, all a 31 band graphic EQ is each fader has a set frequency or a set octave. There's 3 faders per octave, right? So it's 31 bands or 31 faders in there. So like I said, what I just described to you was a 31 band graphic EQ. So one thing that's really important about EQ to realize is that when you're mixing, you don't necessarily want everything to sound pristine. You don't want everything to sound like it normally does, soloed by itself to your ear. Because if you did that, then nothing would come through. You're like carving out spaces for things to lay. You're kind of wanting everything to kind of lay in the mix, and you're having to dip out a spot where something can sit in. For example, bass guitar and kick drum. They kind of live in the same area, but you don't want them necessarily doing the exact same thing. So a lot of times what a lot of people will do, they'll take the boxy or around 250 to 400 and they'll pull it out and they may bump the bass in that area. That way you've kind of carved out a spot for the bass to sit, right? That's EQ in a nutshell. The thing about EQ, like I was saying just a second ago, is that you can't really afford for everything to sound amazing, because if everything, it's like photography, if everything is in focus, then your eye doesn't know what to go to, or nothing is in focus. If you're like one of the things I love about videography and photography sometimes is that sometimes there is what you call a shallow depth of field, which means your eye or the camera focuses on one particular thing and everything else is blurry. That's kind of what EQ is to audio. You want to EQ something and you want to make something sound great, but you want everything else to kind of fall away a little bit. That's what you're doing with filters and EQ. You probably are familiar with some old school type EQ terminology on your mom and dad's or your grandparents' stereo, right? Or even your stereo. There's a treble and a bass, and the treble is basically a shelf EQ, which means that it has a certain band of frequencies and it pushes everything above that band equally. And then the bass, same way. You have a set frequency, and most of the time on your mom and dad's hi-fi system, it's not selectable, it's just You just turn it up or turn it down. And usually there's a center section that kind of clicks on the knob, and then as you turn it up, you're boosting, and as you go to the knob or go to the detent, and then you go left, you're cutting. So basically, treble and bass, you're very familiar with it. Okay, so what I've got on the screen right here, this is a graphic EQ. Now this is not 31 bands, this is a 10 band. This is a famous API 560. These are really cool because you see these frequencies here, and if you could name them, you might name them woof, or maybe 63 would be woof, 125 would be boom, 250, 500 might be box, 1K might be honk, 2K might be crisp, 4K might be Essie, 8K might be airy, and 16K might be something only small children and dogs can hear, but it gives, or air, it would be called air, I guess. That's a graphic EQ. Now let me pull up another EQ here, and this is actually more graphical because you can actually see what's going on. Well, these are bands here, and each band is selectable. You can add, as you can see, you can pull up from right down here to the very bottom at 17, and you can push that all the way up to as far as it'll go. It looks like it'll go all the way to 21,000 cycles. So on this one, you just turn the bands on and off. I haven't used this one too much. I have my go-tos. So this is more, you would just grab a band and push it or pull it. So much like the graphic EQ that we saw here, these bands are selectable and tweakable. You can also change the Q of the band because sometimes you want it to be tighter. Let's go to this one here. And sometimes you want it to be tighter, like really, you like maybe you hear some hum, and you know it's at 60 hertz, and you pull it down to 60 hertz, and you get rid of the hum. You don't want it terribly wide because, in addition to the hum you get rid of some low frequency stuff that you actually like. So this is basically the next step from a graphic EQ. Now, speaking of parametric EQ, this is one of my favorites here. Now, it's just this section here that is the EQ. The right-hand side of this particular plugin is compression, which we'll cover later, gate, which we'll cover later, and then just the in and out section. So on the left, let's start from the bottom. Now the bottom is a low shelf EQ, and you can boost it, and you can find where you want that shelf to start pushing stuff. And when you do, you can boost it or cut it. And then on this particular EQ, you can also hit bell, and when you hit bell, it makes it not a shelf anymore. It makes it more like the one we just looked at, where you can actually change the shape of the curve that you're cutting or boosting. This is a preset bell. Now let's look all the way up to the top. This does the same thing, except it does the high frequencies. You can push, pull, or boost, or cut, whatever how you want to call it. And this is the frequency that you are boosting or cutting. And then you can hit bell, and when you turn bell on, it makes it the curve. So this off means it's a shelf, and which is very popular, and more like the treble and bass control. And then with it turned on, it's more of like a parametric EQ, but set to a certain curve. Now these two middle ones, they're a little bit more versatile because you can boost and cut any frequency at any curve. You see this one goes up here, and it's more of a wide bell curve, and this one's more of like what we call a notch filter, and it actually notches it out like your grandpa taking a knife with a stick and cutting out one little piece of wood. This is what this does. This notches it out, and this is more of a wider bell, more pleasing to the ear. This one sounds more like a wah-wah pedal if you were to sweep it up and down like this, and this one sounds more like a tone control on your stereo. Okay, Same thing with the low mids. LMF is low mid frequencies. This is exactly the same, except this one only goes from 200 hertz to 2.5 kilohertz. This one goes from 600 hertz to 7K. So you can see that they overlap just to give you the most flexibility. All right, so that's a parametric EQ. That's one of my favorites. Okay, so now that we've seen a few of these EQs and you know what to listen for, and when you familiarize yourself with the way something should sound and the way something maybe is conflicting in the mix and you want to carve out that place for it to sit, now you know that you should grab an EQ. I want to tell you though about some common mistakes that people make with EQ. The first thing that a lot of people do, especially beginners and even advanced people, because we want that instant gratification. They say the human brain will go to pleasure or avoid pain, right? So when we want something to sound better, a lot of times we'll do is do the pleasure thing, and we'll just bump up the highs, bump up the lows, and you've got what we call a smiley face, which comes from this EQ here. When you push this guy and you make a big smiley face EQ out of it, it does sound great. Well, that may be the opposite there. That's a frowny face right there. But you get the picture. A lot of people, what they'll do is they'll create a smiley face curve on everything, and they'll leave the mids to just be, whatever happens, right? So you don't want to do that when you're EQing. What you want to do when you're EQing is to avoid the pain. So what you would do is you would boost in the frequency band that you think that painful sound is. Like, say something sounds boxy. So you would find that boxy frequency and push it up. And then on a parametric, you would sweep the frequency until that is the sound that is definitely what I don't like. So you find the pain and reduce the gain. So you boost the gain, find the pain, and then take it down below 0, and that's basically what we call subtractive EQ. And subtractive EQ is the more mature mixers tend to use. Now, effectively, if you did a smiley face where you bumped up the lows and you bumped up the highs, basically, in essence, if you pulled everything down, you're literally cutting the mids, right? But you really don't have any control over where those mids are cut, because you're dependent on where you boosted the lows and boosted the highs. So what you want to do is do that, but do it with more control. And instead of adding gain to everything by boosting everything, you want to subtract stuff, because subtracting actually gives you more headroom to play with, right? It keeps things from distorting so quickly. It's just a more mature way of doing it. So EQ. Let me leave you with this one more thing about EQ. You remember in the very beginning, I mentioned that if everything is in focus, then you don't really know, your eye doesn't really know what to look at. You could be looking at something way off in the background when actually somebody in the picture wanted you to look at whatever's in the front. But if whatever's in the front is the same focus as what's in the back, then you have no control over what people see in the picture, unless you take a camera that has a shallow depth of field and you focus on what you want them to focus on, and there's no reason for people's eyes to go to other places because they can't see it that clear anyway. EQ is the same way. Let me leave you with one more image that may be helpful. I had a friend to say one time that if you take all of the colors, and instead of like leaving this red and leaving this blue and leaving this orange here, and instead you try to make every color equal, then what you end up with is something that's gray or brown or something that doesn't have that character of the color on the canvas. Mixing is the same way. Everything, that's why a lot of people don't advocate for mixing while soloing things, because when you solo, you are focused on making that one thing that is soloed sound great. when in reality, it's just one of 100 things that need to blend in. Perhaps you need to take it and unfocus it a little bit with EQ. You may take a little top end off of it. You may take a little bottom end off of it to make it sit, or unfocus it with EQ. So this is the basics of mixing, and that is EQ. And I really hope that's helpful. Hey, if it is helpful, come next week. We're going to be talking about compression. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, and don't forget that I have some training that deep dives into some of this stuff, and it's called mixcoach.com/workshop. Okay, so go to workshop, subscribe, hit the bell button so you'll know when this goes live again, and then go and check out that workshop. Okay, until next week, thanks for coming, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.